So, like I was saying, Section 3 deals with the end of the Roman Empire, so to speak. Um, the empire is actually going to split into two separate empires, the Eastern and the Western Roman empires. The Western Roman Empire is actually going to fall, but the Eastern Roman Empire continues for another 1,000 years almost. So, by the end of the AD 200, we start to see a lot of problems um, really rearing their heads in the Roman Empire. Roman emperors have given up some of the land that Rome had conquered. Um, it's just too much. They have too much. It's difficult to maintain the level of expansion that their method, that their whole system is based on. It's difficult to govern such a large stretch of land, especially when you have enemies in the surrounding territories, or you conquered groups of people that are waiting for you to show some sort of weakness so that they can reclaim what is theirs. So, several emperors actually fear that they have become too large to govern, and they are correct. Those fears prove to be absolutely true. There are new threats to the empire as well, or threats that have always been there are becoming more prominent. Germanic tribes to the north, groups like the Goths, Visigoths, Vandals, they are starting to attack the Roman northern borders quite a bit. There have always been these, as we call them, barbarian tribal groups around the borders and attacking at the borders. It becomes more um, constant. Now, the Romans do conquer and fight some of these groups of people, uh, but it becomes more difficult to control those further reaching territories. Uh, for about 200 years, the Romans are defending against these attacks from Germanic tribal groups, but it's expensive to spend your time constantly defending your borders against these regular raids and attacks. People on the borders start to become afraid. They're nervous. They're close to enemy territory. The threat of an attack is constant. And so we start to see people from the borders leaving the borders to protect themselves and abandoning the land there. It creates a problem as far as farming is concerned. People living near the border are just too nervous to continue farming there. And so Rome actually starts inviting German farmers to come into Roman territory and grow food enough to support the empire. Um, Here's the thing. Most of these German farmers belong to the same tribal groups that have been attacking the Roman borders and that they've warred with in the past. So uh, they kind of invite the enemy into their territory in a lot of ways. They end up also recruiting a lot of Germans into their legions. Um, by the end of the Western Roman Empire, most of the Roman legions is made up of Germanic barbarian tribal recruits who have been more Romanized. So over time, entire German communities are moving into the empire. They choose their own leaders. They largely ignore the emperor and his edicts. Disease also sweeps across the empire, and we start to see a rise in issues with banditry. So now the roads aren't safe. Rome's having difficulty protecting its citizenry from violence, from bandits. Taxes increase, so that creates issues with bandits as well. People are poor, they're hungry, they're going to take what they need eventually. Not going well. Uh, and the number of poor Romans is increasing. It's just not prospering as it was before. Now, the Romans are looking for a strong leader. And in the late 200s, they find that in an emperor named Diocletian. Now, he believed the empire is too big. He's totally right. So what he does is restructures the empire. He separates the Western territories into the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern territories into the Eastern Roman Empire. And the Eastern Roman Empire is actually going to far outlive the Western Roman Empire. So the Western Roman Empire will have its own emperor, and so will the Eastern Roman Empire. He also does this thing where he creates like an emperor in each section, and a co-emperor, like a subordinate emperor who will take over after. They call the emperor that's ruling at the time the Augustus. Yes, they're throwing back to the origins of the Roman Empire, because then they call the junior emperor a Caesar. Typically, the daughter, especially like of the ruling emperor, would be married to the Caesar, and so kind of works like that, I guess. Anyway, both the Western and Eastern Roman Empire have this Augustus and have a Caesar. So there are 4 rulers of Rome overall, of the total Roman Empire. Now, in 305, Diocletian and his co-Augustus, Maximian, actually abdicate and give control of each empire to their Caesars, who now become the new Augustuses. These Caesars were named Galerius and Constantius. And it probably would have worked fine. But in the year 312, the sons of Constantius and Maximian, Constantine and Maxentius, fight for control of the West. Constantine has control of the East, and he wants the West. So they go to war over it, and Constantine ultimately wins, and he's going to become the next emperor of Rome, but he's also going to reunite temporarily the Eastern and Western Roman empires. It's not going to last, but he does take control. Also, Constantine was the first emperor of Rome to become a Christian, and he's the reason why Christianity was no longer banned in the Roman Empire. So Constantine has quite an impact on the Roman Empire for a couple of reasons. First, he actually moves the capital city, which has been Rome since forever, to a new city called Byzantium, which is in the Eastern Roman Empire. And he renames the city Constantinople after himself. Which officially marks the shift of power from the Western Roman Empire to the Eastern Roman Empire. Rome is no longer the center of the Roman Empire. It's now Constantinople. Rome is not the focus anymore. So even though we're calling it the Roman Empire, it's not really quite the same, is it? This is the breakdown of the separation between the Eastern and Western Roman Empire. So everything in orange is the Western Roman Empire, complete with the city of Rome. And then everything in purple is the Eastern Roman Empire. So there's a big shift to the eastern side of the Mediterranean Sea from Europe and from Italy. Lots of changes happening. And again, the Eastern Roman Empire is going to continue. The Western Roman Empire is not. It's going to fall. Let me pause the recording. Okay, so like the video said, there's something called the cycle of the empires, in which civilizations rise and fall. Every civilization that's ever risen has eventually fallen. Nothing really lasts forever. And so there is this cycle of empires where they ultimately end. And that's what's going to happen to the Roman Empire. Now, in the year AD 376, a group called the Huns, which is a nomadic horse riding group of warriors from the Far East, from Central Asia, actually sweep into the Black Sea region, where a lot of these Germanic tribes have formed a sort of Gothic confederation. The Goths were a group of Germanic tribal peoples, and they're separated into the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths. So that's where that comes from. So they actually destroy the Gothic Federation. They formed this like huge alliance of different groups of German tribes, and even had a royal family at that time. And the Huns destroy them and then incorporate or like bring in a lot of these Gothic tribes, mostly unwillingly, under their control. And the Huns are pretty brutal to them. Now, a lot of those German tribal groups have to leave their land to escape the Huns. One group in particular, the largest group of Goths, the Visigoths, um, actually flee into Roman territory. They flee into Roman territory. But the Romans treat them just as brutally as the Huns had. And ultimately, it's going to lead to conflict. The Visigoths, I think, kind of hoped for shelter and help, and they were met with brutality. And ultimately, what happens is they rise up against the Romans and fight them, and then end up forcing a sort of agreement at which they are allowed to settle within Roman territory. It doesn't last very long um, because they're ultimately going to attack the city of Rome. So, if you look at this map here, as you can see, Constantinople is now the center of the Roman Empire. Now, the Huns invade. You can see that they establish a capital here for a time, and they go all the way over to like France. A group called the Vandals spreads out, fleeing from the Huns, goes into Africa, and then they go up, and they'll end up attacking Rome. So we end up with the Visigoths flee into Roman territory, and they'll end up attacking Rome, and the Vandals will attack Rome, and a lot of different groups are actually going to ultimately end up attacking the Romans. This is how the Anglo-Saxons end up in Britain and end up becoming like the main people group in Britannia as well. So the Huns invading Europe has this like far-reaching effect, and plays a large role in why Rome falls. So the Visigoths forced the Romans to allow them to settle within the territory of the empire, and like maintain their own leaders. They don't want to follow the emperor or anything like that. So for a time, the Romans actually pay them not to attack Rome, and then those payments stop. So the Visigoths are like, okay. So in the year 410, they sack the city of Rome. They attack and sack the city of Rome. This is only one sacking of Rome. There's more than one. By this time, the majority of the Roman army is actually made up of German tribesmen that are loyal to Rome, and have sort of integrated into the existing Roman military structure. So a huge portion of the people in the Western Roman Empire at this point are Germanic tribesmen. And another quick. So, the Visigoths under Alaric attack Rome and sack it, and then another barbarian group called the Vandals will attack again in AD 455. They sack Rome much more thoroughly this time. Other groups, the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, and the Franks, all end up launching their own attacks. Meanwhile, the Huns under Attila the Hun have raided Roman territory in the east. Um, and if I recall correctly, they only didn't attack or sack Rome because the Pope of Rome convinced them to leave. I could be getting that mixed up. I'll have to look that up again because it's been a little while since I read about that. So, by the AD 450s, barbarian military leaders in Rome have pushed aside a series of incompetent emperors in order to sort of seize control of Rome for themselves, in order to try and protect Rome, even though they belong to or came from these tribal groups themselves. A lot of them are actually loyal to the city of Rome. Um, the last Senate affirmed Roman emperor in the West is actually deposed in 476, and imperial presence is eventually going to cease to exist in Italy altogether. So the Roman Empire pretty much officially collapses in on itself like a dying star. The Western Roman Empire does. Now, the Ostrogothic king Theodoric is granted the title of patrician by the Eastern Roman Emperor, a man named Zeno, uh, and is then able to invade Italy in AD 489. He has Zeno's blessing to do so. So he's got the blessing of the Eastern Roman Emperor to basically take over Italy and claim what was the Western Roman Empire. Theodoric's a king to the Germanic tribesmen, to Romans. He's a patrician and a military commander in the West. So he kind of is, because he's a patrician, given that sort of respect. That's the whole point of giving him the title of patrician, so that he can rule that region without hurting Rome's pride, basically. In reality, there is no imperial presence in Italy anymore. People in the East, some of them think there is, but there's not. They don't have any control over the Western Roman Empire anymore. Even further territories like Britain are completely abandoned by the Roman legions, and barbarian kingdoms start to form across what had been the Western Roman Empire. It's officially done for. The Western Roman Empire no longer exists. Reasons it fell: the Roman Empire was too large. There were cultural changes in the adoption of Christianity that's kind of undermined Roman culture. So it's made people less loyal to the empire itself. There's been corruption in the Roman government that made the Western Roman government a very inefficient. Nepotism, offering positions and jobs to people just because you know them, not because buying positions, things like that. Wealthy citizens actually flee to their country estates. Some of them make their own armies to protect themselves. And then Rome's population has decreased, taxes have increased, schools have closed, many Romans are left poor. And by the late 400s, Rome's changed. The Western Empire has collapsed around itself. The city of Rome's not the same by any means at that point. And the empire, the Western Roman Empire, those original territories, don't have any control over them. Now, the Western Roman Empire has collapsed, but the Eastern Roman Empire, which is otherwise known as the Byzantine Empire, the Byzantine Empire, because the city of Constantinople was originally called Byzantium, or Byzantium. Check that. The Byzantine Empire continues to prosper for centuries. One emperor from the Byzantine Empire you need to be familiar with is Justinian, who ruled from 527 to 565. Now, he actually has some success in reclaiming some of the territories of the Western Roman Empire, because it's his goal to reclaim and reassess control over what was the Western Roman Empire. He conquers a lot of Italy, so he has some success. It's just not going to last. The rulers that come after him aren't going to be able to maintain control of those territories he took. He also organized all of the empire's laws into this new legal system that they call Justinian's Code. It simplifies the law. It helps guarantee fair treatment for all. It also removed unchristian and out-of-date laws. Keep in mind, the Byzantine Empire is 100% a Christian empire. And so anything that goes against the Christian church isn't welcome. This is also where the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is spread across particularly Eastern Europe and Russia, this is where it originates. It came from the Byzantine Empire. Now, Justinian's successful, but he has quite a few enemies. In fact, there was an uprising that threatened to drive him from the city of Constantinople in the year 532. Fortunately, he has a wife that's smart. Her name's Theodora. She advises him to stay and fight. He takes her advice. He stays and fight. He puts the riots down, and then he rules effectively for the rest of his reign. After his death, the Eastern Empire does decline. They start losing a lot of the land that Justinian had gained. And then in the year 1453, almost 1,000 years after the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the Ottoman Empire captures Constantinople, and the Byzantine Empire comes to an end. And so we see the fall of the Western Roman Empire much earlier. The Ottoman Empire was a rival empire in the region around Turkey, and had quite a good bit of territory in what would have originally been Persia. And so they ultimately do defeat the Eastern Roman Empire, and that's it. That's the end of the Roman empires. They're finally at an end. Does anybody have any questions?